Dred Scott versus Sanford, Chief of Justice Roger B. Taney. The Chief of Justice for my case in Dred Scott versus Sanford is Roger B. Taney. Roger Taney was born March 17, 1777, to his mother Monica Brooke and his father Michael Taney. He was born in Calvert, Maryland. Taney studied law with Judge Jeremiah Chase. He was admitted to the bar in 1799 at Annapolis and served 1 year in the Maryland House. In 1799, he was admitted to the bar and served 1 term as a Federalist representative in the state legislature. Professional career. He was in the Supreme Court of the United States from 1836 to 1864. He was an Attorney General for the United States from 1831 to 1833, and in 1827 he was appointed Attorney General of Maryland. Presidential appointment. In 1833, President Jackson appointed him Secretary of Treasury, but opposition to Taney and his financial program was so strong that the Senate rejected him in June 1834. Marking the first time that Congress had refused to confirm a presidential nominee for a cabinet post. Landmark cases ruled on. March 6, 1857, in Dred Scott v. Sanford, the decision argued that Scott was a slave and as such was not a citizen and could not sue in federal court. Another court case was Fight against the Bank of the United States. Taney had been an outspoken leader in the Democrats' fight against the central bank. Taney believed it abused its powers, and he strongly advised the president to veto the congressional bill that would renew the bank's charter. Taney was the first Roman Catholic to serve on the Supreme Court. Also, before his career in law, he was a prosperous tobacco grower in Calvert County in Maryland. January 7, 1806, Taney had married his wife Anne Key, and they had 7 children. Roger Taney died October 12, 1864, in Washington, D.C. Dred Scott v. Sanford. The people involved in the case were Dred and Harriet Scott originally, and the defendant was John Sanford. When did the case happen? In April 1846, Dred and Harriet filed separate lawsuits for freedom in St. Louis Circuit Court against Irene Emerson based on 2 Missouri laws. In November 1853, Scott filed a separate federal lawsuit with the United States Circuit Court for District of Missouri. May 15, 1854, the federal court heard Dred Scott v. Sanford and ruled against Scott, holding him and his family in slavery. The case originated in 1846. Harriet and Dred Scott filed individual lawsuits for their freedom in Missouri State Court in St. Louis on the grounds that their residence in a free state and a free territory had freed them from the bonds of slavery. It was later agreed that only Dred's case would move forward, leading to Scott v. Emerson. In Dred Scott v. Sanford, argued in 1856, decided 1857, the Supreme Court ruled that Americans of African descent, whether free or slave, were not American citizens and could not sue in federal court. Finally, the court declared that the rights of slave owners were constitutionally protected by the Fifth Amendment because slaves were categorized as property. The jury ruled that Scott could not sue in federal court because he had already been a deemed slave under Missouri law. Scott appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which reviewed the case in 1856. However, once brought to Supreme Court, they tried to argue that his case was not valid, calling he wasn't a citizen. The court ruled that because Scott was a Negro whose ancestors were imported into this country and sold as slaves, he could not fight his case. The Supreme Court decided that Americans of African descent, whether free or slave, were not American citizens and could not sue in federal court. The court also ruled that Congress lacked power to ban slavery in the U.S. territories. Finally, the court declared that the rights of slave owners were constitutionally protected by the Fifth Amendment because slaves were categorized as property. In conclusion, Scott lost his fight for freedom. The impact it had on American society. Many constitutional scholars consider the Supreme Court's ruling in Dred Scott's case to be the worst decision ever rendered by the court, in particular because of the injustice and racial bias.